Hello and a very warm welcome. I'm Bronwen Maddox, Director of the Institute for Government, and I'm really delighted to be talking today to Anneliese Dodds, Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. As you all know, she's been the MP for Oxford East since 2017. Very recent, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, brought her into his new Shadow Cabinet in April, drawing on her expertise. For 3 years, she was Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. She's also been, in the past, a member of the European Parliament for South East England. Anneliese Dodds, a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bronwen. It's really good to be here, and I've always enjoyed events held by the Institute for Government. I have to say I'm very excited that we even have an individualised hashtag for this event, which is very technologically sophisticated, but genuinely it's really, really good to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion over the next hour. Lovely.
It is an hour, and so everyone, thanks for watching, and do start sending in your questions now, because they really do stack up, and I know we've had an immense amount of interest in this. Well, look, Anneliese Dodds, we've got too much to talk about, so let's plunge straight in. And where I wanted to start was with the Chancellor's statement recently on the coronavirus response, the latest coronavirus response. And you expressed concern about what Rishi Sunak announced last week. What would you have done differently?
Well, we did support a number of elements of what the Chancellor announced. As probably people will be aware, we had been calling for some time for government to look at some of those active labour market schemes that have worked quite well in the UK previously. So the example of the Future Jobs Fund obviously was there from after 2008-9, but also the work that the Welsh Labour government has been doing, a kind of similar programme for young unemployed people. So we have been really pushing that quite strongly. I'm very pleased that government seems to have listened to that with the Kickstarter scheme for young people. Of course, we really need to make sure those jobs are additional ones, and that we have the linkage to local employment systems that was there with the Future Jobs Fund. But that was really encouraging. Other areas where we said that government should be open-minded around stimulating demand as well. It's good to see some action in those areas. I suppose, however, we do have concern around kind of two main avenues, really. I would say, first of all, clearly we're still in a situation where there's a major lack of confidence in the UK economy, and much of that relates to whether people feel that the test, track and isolate system is working properly, whether it's sufficiently responsive and able to, for example, avoid major additional large lockdowns, as arguably we're seeing currently in Leicester. Now, we really think that we need to have much more of a focus on this from government. Some would say it's a health issue, but unless people have confidence that they know where infections are, we're unlikely to see that additional footfall that's so necessary in so many businesses. So, we really do need more of a focus on that. But then secondly, with the economic package, I think we are concerned, and in fact, it was interesting to see the OBR's research on this yesterday, that clearly this is a crisis unlike any other. It is one when government has chosen, rightly, to close particular sectors, but that means that withdrawing the job retention scheme and the self-employed scheme across all sectors at the same time is very, very risky indeed, particularly when there aren't alternative sources of support available. We're not convinced that the job retention scheme bonus that the Chancellor announced is going to do enough to incentivise employers, particularly when they're already heavily indebted, to be keeping people on. So we would have liked to have seen a shift away from the one-size-fits-all approach that's been taken by the Chancellor to withdrawing those programmes, something that's more targeted, learning from other countries around this, perhaps around short hours working schemes. So we think otherwise that is going to be pushing up unemployment in the weeks and months to come.
Great. Well, there's a lot there, and I want to come back to some of those points you put in the middle about confidence and what can be done to restore it. But let's just stay on the jobs question for the moment, where you've given us already quite a bit of detail. But this is obviously where the big focus is at the moment, and the government's aim to try to prevent the big surge in unemployment that many people are talking about now. So you talked about not having a one size fits all in terms of the furlough scheme, and getting rid of that. Which sectors would you go out to protect at this moment? So extend the furlough, give them better claim on the furlough scheme, perhaps extending that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first priority surely has got to be those parts of the economy that are still not allowed to reopen. I mean, you think about events companies, for example, different forms of leisure where they're still closed for the foreseeable future. I would say that has got to surely be the first priority, but then also considering other areas where, although they may be able to operate, they have very little chance of returning to full capacity. And I'm not suggesting that necessarily this would be a case of continuing the scheme under exactly the same arrangements. You know, it does need to become more flexible. But I think we do know from other countries that unless you have some kind of wage support, if you have very, very disrupted, supply chains and very, very much reduced demand, then the natural result is going to be additional unemployment, sadly. And I think we've had a little bit of a foretaste of that, over the last couple of weeks, really.
And you mentioned the OBR figures, which are not great for those hoping, like the chief economist of the Bank of England, for a V-shaped recovery. Well, I mean, lots of people are hoping for a V-shaped recovery. But just go back to that. You mentioned the events sector. Isn't the government there doing what you've said it should do, and differentiating between sectors? And it's saying, look, on health grounds, we can't let this one sector open up, but we are allowing other sectors to open up.
Oh yes, I'm not criticising the principle of having a differential approach to opening sectors. I think that is necessary. Clearly, that's got to be driven always by the scientific and medical evidence. That's absolutely critical. And it does look likely, sadly, that those businesses which rely on very close social contact with very large numbers of people, that they will be affected by public health related measures for really quite a long time. So, I fully understand that. But then I would say that the economic response has got to reflect that different public health led reality. So not having the support there continuing for those sectors which simply cannot open does seem to be a peculiar position to be adopting. And, I've said many times that this will not be easy for government. It is difficult to differentiate between sectors. I know the Chancellor has been keen not to do that. He says that would be putting government in the position of picking winners. But effectively, government has had to designate losers. It's had to say which sectors needed to close because of the public health emergency that we're in. And so therefore, I think the economic response does need to reflect that more. It does need to be more targeted than particularly much of what we saw last week.
OK, so great. So let's explore this a bit more. Do you think that some jobs should be are more important to preserve than others? We've heard a lot of talk about rebalancing of the economy in this because of coronavirus, not just generally, and that the coronavirus may have triggered a shift from some service jobs, perhaps from the retail sector to other sectors. Would Labour actually seek to use the crisis to protect some jobs, but perhaps not others?
I don't think that this crisis, I mean, there's obviously a big discussion around what's occurring now, sometimes using terms like, opportunity, etc. I mean, I personally don't think that's a helpful way of looking at things. I mean, clearly, we're seeing in the UK extremely large numbers of people suddenly, in many cases, some older workers becoming unemployed for the first time in their lives, and, pretty catastrophic impacts on their incomes. But I do think in the UK, we seem to be, however, in quite a distinct position compared to many other economies. So we see, for example, quite a low rate of additional vacancies coming back into the UK jobs market, whereas in countries like France and Poland, they're almost back to where they were previously with vacancies. That does seem to reflect something about the balance in our economy, particularly around services, those social consumption related jobs being a much more significant part of our economy. Indeed, the Chancellor himself has acknowledged this. It does seem to mean that the crisis is having a greater impact on us now. And perhaps to an extent, it explains a bit why we didn't necessarily see that big impact on unemployment from the global financial crisis previously. I mean, we saw constrained investment over quite a long period, but that didn't feed through into necessarily unemployment because many employers, they were taking on additional people at relatively low cost, not necessarily providing then the capital investment so that those jobs were as productive as they could have been. Do we need to change that balance into the future? Yes, I absolutely think we should. But I think maybe looking at it through the prism of the kind of unemployment situation many people are facing right now might not be the best way of doing that.
You did have, as you're alluding to, very high employment rates before coronavirus, and in fact, unemployment at almost record lows. Do you think the Chancellor was right to put the emphasis he did on the very showy bit of his statement, the meal deal, as it's been called, the eat out to help out? Because it's aimed at exactly these jobs we're sort of talking about in hospitality and so on.
I mean, we had been calling for targeted measures, but I think really critical to this is that issue around confidence and around really getting a grip on being able to identify where infection is spreading and being able to respond very, very quickly. I'm sure people will have seen some of the polling evidence around individuals' likelihood to actually use those mechanisms. Relatively low take-up from what I understand, still many people saying that they wouldn't want to go back into restaurants and cafes. You know, I really want us to get to a situation where people feel safe going back into those locations. And I don't think that's predominantly a question for employers. You know, I've talked to many businesses who've been working incredibly hard to make sure that their workplaces are very, very safe, that people feel comfortable when they're in them. I think it really is about getting that test, track and isolate system working properly. And, you know, again, looking very carefully at what's going on in other countries where there's been a bit of a depression of demand, or maybe even a substantial one, but not quite to the same extent as we're seeing in some parts of the UK economy now. So I think really more does need to be done to build up that confidence. Incentives on their own won't have the strong impact that they could do otherwise if confidence isn't there.
I mean, you said in Parliament last week, it very much is the kind of theme you're arguing now, that fear is hurting our economy, that, you know, the incentives aren't enough on their own to cut through that. And so would you put the weight, as you've been alluding to in this conversation, on the improving the test and trace to give people that confidence?
I think that is very important, and I have called on the Chancellor previously to do that. I appreciate, you know, many people would say, well, this is ultimately a health question, but actually we do need to see this as something that's absolutely critical for our economy. It relates to issues around education, of course, as well. You know, we still have very large numbers of people who aren't able to work as they would normally because they are looking after children, because they don't have confidence around schooling, etc. You know, this is something that needs to be sorted out and urgently. And as I said, it is an area where we can look at other countries which seem to be further on with developing those systems and ensuring that there's public trust around them.
Well, let's go on to, if you like, the second cluster of things we're going to discuss, which is really around tax and how to pay for all this. And of course, it's on the front page of lots of papers today that the Chancellor has written to the Office for Tax Simplification, asking it to look at all kinds of things, including rates of capital gains tax, and even possibly that old question that's hung over British tax policy for decades of whether primary residences should continue to be completely exempt from capital gains. You've said Labour's not calling for tax rises, we're calling for growth. What is your account of how the country ought to pay for this?
Well, I really do think it's important that we focus on growth right now. I think that's absolutely critical. We know that actually that is the best way, in a context of low interest rates, at least that is the best way to be ensuring that the debt is manageable, that we can then have a long-term approach and paying it off. I think that not having that focus on pushing up demand would be very damaging. And actually, you know, there's been some suggestions before today's news around capital gains tax, were some suggestions previously that there could be a kind of generalised income tax, VAT or national insurance rise and or cuts to public spending, I think that would be really quite a dangerous move at a time when the economy is very fragile and where so many people are very nervous about deciding to buy a new car or to put an extension on their house or whatever it is. Now would not be a sensible time to be suggesting to people that either public sector job, well in fact many of them are going in local authorities, but that employment could be further threatened, or equally on the other side that they could be subject to additional tax. So I think, while it's kind of interesting context of capital gains, because I remember not so long ago when we were trying to encourage the Treasury to deal with some of the issues around particularly non-UK investors with envelope dwellings and all this kind of thing, and trying to get them to get a grip on this, and they're very, very resistant to doing that. But I think right now that focus has got to be, I would say, on pushing up demand rather than looking at tax changes.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. So is Labour's plan essentially to look at increasing debt until the economy is back on track?
Well, our plan is to try and make sure that we have more people in work, that we try and keep unemployment obviously down as much as possible, such that people then themselves are paying tax as well as companies, that companies are profitable so that they can be paying corporation tax, etc. That ultimately is the sensible route currently in order to ensure that we can hopefully, have a sustainable recovery. And if we don't have that, if we don't see that growth, we can kind of shift the deck chairs around, as it were, when it comes to taxation, but we won't be increasing the size of the ship. And that's really what we need to be doing right now. That's what we need to focus on. And I think arguably, I know it's a very, very different crisis, but we did see quite constrained growth in demand after the global financial crisis, particularly from 2010 onwards. I think we need to learn from that, not repeat the mistakes of that in our recovery from the current crisis.
Well, this government said it doesn't even like the word austerity, never mind want to repeat cuts to public services. But I'm wondering then how you describe the difference between Labour's economic thinking and the government's, because we've got a government that is willing to dare the bond markets at the moment and spend its way out of trouble, including paying people not to work. And it doesn't want to talk about austerity, and it doesn't want cuts to public services. Where is the dividing line between you?
I would say that actually the kind of rhetoric and the reality is slightly different here. We know, I just alluded to it in the case of local authorities, that some of them may be looking potentially to make redundant up to a fifth of their workforce, potentially within 12 months, actually, because of the financial constraints that they're under. I think that's lacking the kind of longer term perspective that we really need. Clearly, local authorities have been given a critical role, actually, in getting local economies functioning and safe. They're responsible for our high streets being safe and ensuring that consumers, feel that if they go to those hubs of local economies, that they're going to be safe when they're within them. So I think that's very, very short-sighted. I would say currently, particularly we're trying to say to governments, please target that money where it is best needed. We've seen some very, very substantial sums, for example, going into Test Track and Isolate, major outsourcing firms being given a big role in that system. When we were saying for really quite a long time that we needed to build on those building blocks of delivery, really, that were already there, particularly local authorities. Eventually we had a bit of a change from government, and finally a kind of hybrid system that's been created. So I would say it's not just kind of about the quantum of spend, as it were. It is about, where it's targeted, whether it's actually going to be helping those who are struggling the most. I'd say again with that job retention scheme bonus, in some cases you could see some really quite large firms benefiting from that. Not clear whether they would then have to keep that value in the company, whether they'd still have to invest it in the UK, etc. We think a more targeted approach would have been much more helpful here.
But I'm still fascinated by this kind of broad differences between you. All right, let's pick one. You mentioned outsourcing, and John McDonnell, your predecessor, and his financial team were sounded pretty cool on the idea of outsourcing. Is that one difference between Labour and the Conservatives? The Conservatives are still very happy to work with that.
Well, I have been really quite concerned, as I mentioned, around some of what's occurred over recent months. We have seen very, very major contracts provided to firms. Now, I would say it's not necessarily the firm's fault. I mean, in some cases, the conditions were really pretty peculiar. You know, for example, not being required to provide timely data to local authorities around where infections are, not being required to indicate, the addresses or, even streets where infections are, seems to me to be a pretty strange way of structuring a localised testing system. So I don't think it's kind of uniquely down to the firms themselves, but certainly, the contracts do not seem to be delivering. This is something that Rachel Reeves, as our Shadow Cabinet Office lead, has been pushing on very consistently. And we are concerned that we're not seeing the delivery that is required there. And actually, it's kind of frustrating. There seems to be a bit of an allergy within government to looking at those public sector bodies who are already there, already keen to deliver some of those services. Greater Manchester, for example, offering to, many local authorities offering to, not being taken up in the offer, and then belatedly being involved when government discovered that, yes, a completely outsourced system doesn't work here. It took them too long to come to that realisation, we would suggest.
And just coming back to the taxes question, because it is very live at the moment. If Rishi Sunak, Conservative Chancellor, proposes a rise in capital gains tax, perhaps equalising it with income tax rates, even breaks that big taboo of levying some kind of capital gains on people's primary residence, their home, surely Labour is going to go along with that. I can't believe I'm asking this in a way, positions so sort of reversed from the traditional. But if you get a Conservative Chancellor proposing these things, surely Labour goes along with it.
Well, we would need to look at the detail of it, obviously, and what the impact of it would be on the economy, whether it's properly targeted, etc. Above all, what we really don't want to have are kind of last-minute decisions around tax without appropriate scrutiny or without proper planning. Arguably, we would say we saw that with stamp duty, where we would have wanted to see an approach which was much more focused on affordability and social housing delivery. But once that had been announced, or rather leaked, it's very, very difficult to then say, well, it shouldn't happen, because clearly, it has a dampening impact on the housing market. So we'd want to look very, very carefully at any proposals. Clearly, for a very long time, I've been saying that the UK tax system is insufficiently progressive. That needs to be dealt with. But do I think that tax changes right now are what government should be focused on? As I said, no, I really don't. I think they must be focused above all on trying to ensure that growth comes back, that demand is increased, and that surely has got to be their absolute priority.
No, this is fascinating, and you've been absolutely consistent about this. People have been watching with enormous interest to see whether the Keir Starmer shadow cabinet and your voice within that, your very important voice setting out the economic thinking of Keir Starmer's team, marks a big break from that of Jeremy Corbyn's team, of which you were part. So can you describe to us the extent to which they are the same or different?
Well, you probably won't like this answer, Bronwen, but whenever people ask me which part of the Labour Party I'm from, I just say, well, I'm just Labour. That's what I am. I think the
yes, you're right. I don't particularly like the answer, because I would love your view of whether they are the same or really distinctly different.
Well, I do think that, these circumstances mean that everything has to be different. We are in a different situation. Clearly, some people would say, although I don't think it's a correct characterisation necessarily, but some people would say that one of the big dividing lines previously was over that that kind of quantum of public investment. And certainly we really did want to deal and continue to want to deal with the lack of resilience of our public services. I think we're seeing that in stark terms right now in terms of social care and indeed our NHS. Some people would say, well, now the government is spending more, as you've just been suggesting. Doesn't that take that dividing line away? So does that mean that there needs to be a different approach from Labour? But as I said before, we are still very much focused on whether that spending is actually delivering, whether it's providing that resilience. And many of those problems that we were focused on before in previous Labour administrations, clearly they haven't gone away. Quite the opposite. I mean, they've been turbocharged by this crisis, all the kind of labour market issues that we've long been seeking to highlight, and so forth. So I don't think there's a kind of big, enormous kind of change there. I think circumstances are leading to a different approach. I would also say actually as well that clearly we are in the middle of a national crisis. It's very, very important that we have a constructive approach to that. I think that's a view that's shared right across the Labour Party, and we've been focused on trying to get to solutions, suggesting solutions to government, rather than criticism for criticism's sake. So it's probably a slightly different kind of party political debate that's going on right now as well.
Is Labour committed, as Ed Miliband has said it is, to net zero by 2030?
Well, we do believe that we need to see an accelerated timetable. As a parliament, we did vote for the contention that we are in the middle of a climate emergency. That's something that was passed by all parties. So if we're in an emergency, we need to act like there is urgent. There are urgent measures that can be taken, and certainly, and obviously, I've talked a lot to Ed Miliband and others, and business and other stakeholders around this. We still don't see economic decisions routinely being subject to analysis for their climate impacts. I obviously called for that for the measures from the Chancellor's statement. That wasn't delivered. I do think, as I said, if we said that there's an emergency, then we need to make sure that we act like there is one. That means where we can, really trying to accelerate that shift towards net zero. And I think, it's been very clear on that. And I think we need to accelerate it as well, as much as we possibly can. We need to make sure when doing so, we take people with us, of course, and that we don't see very, very major dislocation as a result. I mean, I would say aviation here is quite an interesting case where, obviously there's got to be change in that sector because of the climate crisis. There is going to be a structural reduction probably in demand as well because of what's been happening around business travel and so forth. But we kind of see just a big scrap there now, unfortunately, lots and lots of jobs being lost, rather than a more strategic approach, which would enable restructuring, but not in that kind of, very destructive way that's happening currently.
Well, as you said, it is a crisis, but I'm not clear. You talked quite a bit about acceleration. Is that a commitment to 2030 or just to acceleration?
Well, obviously, we have had a long debate around these issues within the Labour Party, including at the time of our previous conference. But, certainly, I mean, my view is that we should be trying to accelerate as much as possible. And actually, some people would say, oh, am I trying to duck the question here? I'm really, really not. I am frustrated that we have a situation where, if we look at the 2050 target, for example, that's something that has already been agreed to, even by the Conservative government, obviously. And yet, as I said before, we're not acting like that is impacting on our current behaviour. We're not using those tests right now on what we do. So, I accept that the target date is important, it is totemic, but actually, if we're not behaving like we need to be, seeking climate neutrality right now, then, we can have all the debates that we like about what the target is, but we're not actually going to be doing very much to reach it. And, it just seems like so many people are, having a kind of mañana approach to this. We really cannot afford that, particularly given we're going to be hosting the COP meeting next year.
Let me ask about Brexit. And you're an MEP and you campaigned to remain and campaigned with Keir Starmer for a people's vote. Can you see a situation where the UK should extend the transition period, and Labour would call for that?
Well, we have been saying to government that they need to make sure that they deliver on their commitment, and their commitment was to get a deal. Obviously, Labour lost the last general election when we had proposed another referendum as a way of dealing with this question. We lost that argument. You know, I regret the fact we did, but we lost it. We've got to accept that. The Conservatives won that election saying that they would get a deal. So clearly we've been saying to them, well, please make sure that you actually deliver on that. I mean, it seems like there are some negotiations that are happening in a more meaningful manner now. We were quite concerned that for some time there didn't seem to have been much progress in that regard. But clearly now we really need to see much more emphatic developments in that regard. And certainly I've made clear that in my role as Shadow Chancellor, I would be very concerned if we ended up in a situation where at the end of the year, we could be seeing additional barriers to trade being put in place for many of those companies that, you know, if they're still there, they will have been really struggling over the summer and into the autumn with very disrupted supply chains and diminished demand. So that would be the kind of nightmare scenario that should be avoided. I mean, it does seem to me that there's quite a lot of will to be pragmatic around different sides. But as I said, government really needs to deliver on that deal that it's promised it would get.
Let me just ask you finally what it's like being up against Rishi Sunak. It is a well-known tradition of people being Shadow Chancellor and suddenly confronted, not the whole time, but confronted with a Chancellor who's doing very, very well. And Rishi Sunak has got some of the loudest plaudits, if you like, in this government, and is thought to be doing very well at the moment. Does it add to the difficulties of being Shadow Chancellor?
I mean, I'm always someone who's focused on the policies rather than the personality, really. I mean, I've always, had a good relationship with him. In fact, when he was a local government minister, I had some dealings with him, and really tried to maintain that kind of a cordial relationship. As I said, I think it's about really pointing out where the issues are with government policy, trying to get change in relation to them. But, quite frankly, in the middle of a crisis like this, it's in everyone's interest that where there are problems, that they get fixed. So that's very much the kind of approach that I've been taking, rather than, a kind of very personalised approach against one individual. That's really not the way that I work.
Okay, well, we'll leave that for the many pen portraits of the Chancellor and his ambitions that are in the papers at the moment. All right, let's go to questions. I've got quite a lot, and they're ranging over all kinds of things. Let's start with one from Thomas Smith, who says the immediate priority is, rightly, in his view, jobs, jobs, jobs. However, looking to the medium to long term, what's the current Labour thinking on a 4-day week?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question, and we were very pleased that the government adopted our call for jobs, jobs, jobs. I suppose flattery comes from imitation, but no, genuinely, because we had been concerned that there wasn't as strong a focus on particularly preventing unemployment than we would have wanted to see. As I mentioned before, I think my concern now, however, is that while government seems to have got the message a bit around active labour market policy with the Kickstart scheme, although we still need to make sure that will work as well as it can do, there is then a big issue about preventing more people falling into unemployment in the first place. And I think there are kind of different policies that have been put forward in relation to this. I think a flexible approach to this is really, really critical, but one which draws from cases from different countries. And, when we've been talking to government and saying that they need to look at changing the job retention scheme, that would be around having targeted support through it, looking at some of those short-hour working schemes. Some people would put that under the rubric of a 4-day week. I'm a bit careful around some of that language, because I think for a lot of people, they're really worried about the fact that they've lost hours. So, don't want to be in a situation where they think that we're calling for people to necessarily have reduced hours. But of course, if you're thinking about it in a short hours context, that would be about government supporting, topping up wages, how the kind of part-time version of furloughs working in some sectors, but making sure there's then more support for those employers who really, really need it.
Okay, right. And thank you for that question. Let's go to another one from Julie Chaw. What do you make of the government's U-turn on Huawei?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's been quite frustrating, really. For many months, we have been saying, before there was all the kind of debate in the press around this, that government needed to have a strategy around our critical communications infrastructure. Obviously, this decision has now come quite late, where a number of issues are being posed as a result. We think that we need to have a long-term perspective, one which reflects security concerns. And, again, we have been calling on government to make sure that Parliament is abreast of those to the extent it's possible to, be open about this. I understand that this is a difficult area, but we were calling for more transparency around this. But, above all, for that strategy, if we're entering a situation, it appears that we are, where we need to ensure that we have, in particular, more domestic capacity around some of this, then please let's have a strategy for that, rather than what seems to be quite kind of last-minute ad hoc decision-making around it.
Well, the government would say, look, we've got a strategy. In fact, we had one before, and then some things changed, particularly the US position and US sanctions. And so now we've got another strategy, which is to get them out, not immediately, but get them out of 5G, over some years. What exactly are you? Do you think it's wrong? Do you think Huawei should be included in and kept as part of this technology, or that it should be more quickly out of absolutely everything? What is Labour's view of it?
Yeah, I mean, you can use the word strategy, but if it doesn't actually determine what the future roadmap is for a critical technology and what the different considerations are and how they'll be dealt with, then I think sometimes it's not necessarily adding up to the kind of strategic approach that we would want to see. I mean, I remember discussions around this last year where there were a number of people raising a variety of different concerns, and the position that seemed to be coming back there was, well, we're kind of looking into this. Well, that isn't really good enough from our perspective. You do need to have a long-term perspective on it. I appreciate that the position of some other nations has changed, but ultimately, and I think we've seen through this crisis, that communications infrastructure is absolutely essential to our economic future as a nation, and indeed to our security. And so really this should have been something that was provided with much more engagement over a longer period. I mean, Sion Bora from the Labour front bench has been making that point for a very, very long time from our Shadow Base team.
I understand the rebarbative point of saying you would have liked the government to spell out things and have its strategy and so on, but I'm asking what the Labour strategy is. So do you think that on Huawei and on China, we are at the moment too cool? We're pushing China away. We're too warm. Still got all kinds of Chinese involvement. What is Labour's strategy? I understand you think the government doesn't have one, but what do you have one?
I mean, I think we really need to be looking very, very carefully at this as a nation. And obviously, I've discussed this quite a bit with our Shadow Foreign Secretary. I think in the past, arguably, there's been insufficient consideration, particularly of what I would describe as unfair competition issues. So, we've got a new trade regime that's coming into play. That after we've left now that we have left the EU and at the end of the transition period, now that would give us very, very limited trade defences compared to other nations. And, we know that there has been dumping before that's been engaged in by China. And, we're concerned that there seemed to be a very, very uncritical approach there. I mean, I knew from my own perspective when I was an MEP that it was the UK government that was pushing very hard indeed for China to be treated as always as a nation that would be a fair trading partner. I think that we do need to look at this in a more nuanced manner into the future. It's taken quite a long time, I think, for government to realise the need for that. I think, we need to recognise very strong trading links between the UK and China while doing that, but we do also need to recognise the potential for unfair competition, which could be very injurious to our domestic industry.
I have a feeling, you forgive me, that we may have to wait for a fully fleshed Labour strategy on China, but we can perhaps come back to that. I've got another one, if you're okay to move on, with from Sally Etchells from the National Deaf Children Society, which says, how can we ensure that all the new job schemes recently announced are accessible to young people with disabilities?
Now, I think that's a very important question. And here again, we have been trying to say to government, while we're pleased that the Kickstarter scheme has been announced, and also some of the additional support for apprenticeships as well and traineeships, we really need to make sure that they are effective schemes, that they're sufficiently attractive to employers, so that they're not just used to substitute, lower cost young people for older workers, but that they really are helping those young people who desperately need the support. I think that, that's particularly the case for young people with disabilities. Also the case for young people who are disadvantaged. I mean, we know, for example, the number of apprenticeships going to disadvantaged young people at lower skill levels has actually been going down quite a bit over time. That really does need to be reversed. And I think for that, we need to have that coordination. It's so necessary, coordination with the different employers, groups, but also with local authorities in the third sector as well. That seemed to deliver quite well with the Future Jobs Fund previously, but we have been trying to say to government that there was an enormous amount of effort that was necessary to get that infrastructure up and going. It didn't just happen overnight. It required really sustained engagement, and with the voluntary sector very much representing some of those different groups who particularly need help, etc. So we need to see now from government an awareness of some of those challenges, and particularly more of a willingness to see some control to those localities and to those other intermediate actors who have expertise, rather than always trying to deliver things from the centre.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's go to one from Robert Morland, a former MEP. Thank you. Saying, given that nearly all reputable economic forecasters estimate that Brexit will be harmful to UK economic growth, are you concerned about Brexit's economic effect on top of the effects of COVID-19? And I guess what would you do about that?
I mean, I'm certainly concerned about the potential impact of a very weak deal or no deal, if that does come at the end of the year. I mean, it's kind of fairly obvious. I'm somebody who campaigned to remain at the time of the referendum. We lost that argument, and as I said before, Labour did not win the last general election. I think we need to accept that. The party that promised that it could get a deal with the EU is now in government, and they really need now to actually demonstrate that they can provide that deal, that they can make sure that, as I said before, at a time when so many businesses are very, very fragile, that they won't then be harmed further as a result of, as I said, a weak or non-existent deal. So clearly we're trying to do all we can to enforce that accountability onto government right now.
Okay, great, thank you. I've got another one, tantalisingly labelled anonymous. It is a very good, short, sharp question. Is it still Labour's policy to scrap universal credit?
Well, yes, it is, to the extent that universal credit is a system that clearly is not working and is not supporting people in the way that they need to be. I mean, Johnny Reynolds, my colleague, has done a huge amount of work on this as our shadow DWP secretary. I suppose a little bit related to the previous discussions that we've been having, I don't think we would be saying that right at this moment, that there should be a reorganisation of the system. The really, really critical thing to do with universal credit right now is to make sure that it's getting money to people that need it, getting rid of the elements of it that are not working. So the fact that there's just a loan for the first 5 weeks, so people aren't getting money when they really need it, so it's pushing them into debt. The fact there's still the 2-child limit, there's still the benefit cap, there's still only 30% of market rents in any given area covered buy universal credit, that needs to go up, obviously, to the average cost of housing, clearly, and there shouldn't be the same level of savings conditionality either at a time when so many people are in crisis. So, there are many, many changes that can and should be made right now to universal credit. But we all know, the huge amount of bureaucracy and administrative issues that have accompanied the application of universal credit. I don't think right now would be the time to be unpicking it, but would Labour want to see a much fairer approach to social security in the future, one that really does help families? Well, absolutely, we really would want to see that different approach.
I mean, there are some in the government who would say, look, universal credit in this crisis has come into its own. It was only because of having a system that, instead of having 6 different benefits, had one, it could get money out to people that quickly. And isn't this the sheer simplicity that, now that it is beginning to work, a reason for keeping it?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I completely agree with that. I mean, I've been genuinely very relieved that the computer system delivering universal credit has not fallen over. That was a real concern, as I understand it, amongst staff, that could have happened. It didn't happen, and I am enormously relieved about that. So to that extent, of course, I'm pleased that the system continued to be able to operate. Of course, I'm relieved around that. But I'm not convinced by many of those arguments. I mean, actually, we used to have social assistance in the UK. We do not have it to any intents or purposes anymore. I mean, we don't have the system of the social fund operating a local level anymore. So I would say that, okay, some aspects, to the extent that it, as I say, it's not completely fallen over. Of course, I'm relieved about that when it comes to universal credit, but do I think that necessarily it's providing the support that people need? I really don't think it is, particularly with the fact that, as I mentioned before, people can only get a loan, a while after they've applied. They're not actually getting that money that they really need. And I think that risks quite a lot of indebtedness.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And I've got a couple on climate change, coming back to that, the difference. So we've got one from George Muscat saying, what should the government's priorities be ahead of what is now next year's COP26 UN Climate Summit? And how should the UK deal with what he's called climate skeptic countries such as China and the US? So from here to the summit, what should it do?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in some ways, I'm quite optimistic about the current period for a variety of reasons. I think that actually business sentiment has changed quite substantially around the climate crisis. We've seen many different firms calling for a green recovery. We've seen major investment packages, of course, in Germany, France, South Korea, Denmark, a whole variety of them focused around a green recovery. Some steps in that direction in the UK context, but we would argue that they're not matching the ambition of those in other nations. So I'm relatively optimistic. It does feel like we're moving in the right direction. But I would go back to that point. I think if we need to avoid any charges of hypocrisy, and that is so critical when it comes to dealing with nations where some political actors might present themselves as more sceptical. If we're to avoid those charges, then we really need to be assessing policies continuously against their contribution to the climate crisis. I think that's very, very important indeed. We can't just be saying that we will put these kinds of questions off into the future. That's got to be an assessment that is done right now. And I think, in terms of the kind of approach of other nations, ultimately, I think we've got to try and be optimistic around this. We've got to use whatever leverage we have with other nations to try and bring them on board. Who knows what the political situation might be in the US next year, for example. We don't know at this stage.
We don't.
Things may change in a different direction. But I think there are other countries where the UK has a strong historical relationship. Australia would be an example where I think if we can really work together in advance of the summit, it would be very encouraging indeed. I suppose major concern that I have from a kind of governance point of view, and obviously the Institute is better placed to comment on some of these issues than I would be, is just around the kind of bandwidth issue. You know, are we going to be able to have those really, really intense discussions at ministerial level that's necessary? And we haven't had there's meant to be a shadow cabinet subcommittee sitting around the climate crisis, as I understand it, that was, you know, scheduled for many months. I think it may have only met once. You know, we really do need to be doing quite a lot more around this agenda to show we're serious about it.
Okay, thanks for that. And as I said, there was another one, it's anonymous. It says, I'm going to hazard a guess, this is a civil servant in the Treasury, we try and account for climate change in how we take decisions through carbon pricing in the Green Book. Is this a call for government to significantly change those prices? A technical question, but saying, look, we do try and do this already, and the Green Book, which is as I'm sure IFG aficionados will know, is how the Treasury goes about assessing the costs and benefits of different projects. It has an element of climate change assessment in there.
Absolutely, it does, and it has a focus on natural capital as well, and various different approaches to assessing benefits and utility. I mean, from my examination of it, and you know, obviously this is an area where government has been kind of active as well, considering whether aspects of the Green Book should be changed, etc. I do think that a number of the elements could be tuned up, actually, genuinely. I mean, I suppose one of the big questions is, well, is it always the Green Book that's driving decisions around different projects, or might other factors be coming into play? I mean, I'm not going to comment on that, but I think that's part of the elephant in the room here around kind of allocation of resources to different areas as well. But to the extent that it's used, I do think there are elements that could be looked at. I mean, for example, some of the approaches to calculating utility over time. I mean, do we need to tune up the utility in the future as a consideration? You know, currently it's discounted, and the view is, you know, current consumption is more valuable than that in the future. Well, probably that's not exactly where we want to be. And I think also, from my point of view, kind of making those, you know, really kind of hardwiring the assessment of natural capital more into the assessment of different projects would be quite helpful. So I do think there's quite a lot that could be done in this area, and you know, where we're really open for ideas on how we can, you know, make the system workable, deliverable, but also really have bites when it comes to climate issues and generally environmental matters as well. Okay,
well, thanks for that. Let's leave climate change. So we're coming to the end, coming close to the end of our time. So I'm going to squeeze in a few more. Sorry, it's a more intense fusillade of questions than you get in real life if we're in our building. Thanks for handling it. One from David Martin saying, an article in Tribune today argues that the government schemes are simply putting money into the pockets of owners of capital, while lasting recovery can only be achieved by putting money into the pockets of low-paid workers. Do you agree?
Okay, I'll try and answer this quickly. I mean, I certainly think that, especially when it comes to boosting demand, that it is critical to be, I mean, it's important from an economic point of view, because we know that people on lower incomes and middle incomes are much more likely to spend additional funds. But of course, it's also important for people's well-being as well, and critically so, especially given so many people are struggling. I mean, a quarter of UK families entered this crisis with less than £100 in the bank. You know, we do need to be making sure that we support people. The first part of the question, I think, is one that is less tractable at the immediate moment of onset of a crisis. I mean, there would be two approaches to this. You know, either you try and design that in to any interventions. So you try and ensure there's a kind of sharing of pain, as it were, designed into interventions. That can result in quite a lot of unintended consequences. I mean, local authorities are landlords in a lot of cases, for example. It's quite tricky to do that. Or do you say, you know, in the future, we should have a situation where, you know, particularly low and middle income people shouldn't be bearing the costs of a crisis that they didn't have a role in making, and that we need to have a different approach. And I think probably the latter is what government needs to be focused on in the future, but that's after we've got through this current crisis and we've hopefully pushed up demand again.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze it to others. Okay, one technical one. How should the government manage the potential bad business debts stemming from the bounce back loan scheme and other guaranteed loans? Would you be in favour of a bad bank which would manage those debts, or perhaps making repayment linked to profits as those recovered?
Yeah, I mean, the latter is something that's been suggested by a number of the business organisations, and it's my understanding that government is currently investigating whether there could be some form of kind of recapitalisation effectively and or a kind of income contingent repayment of loan scheme. I do think that that would be helpful for government to look at. I'm concerned that it looks like we're going to have to wait until the autumn now for any concrete measures in that regard. But I do think that government is going to need to be considering these issues really quite quickly.
Okay, and just one final question then on Scotland, and obviously Labour, which did have a big presence of MPs in Scotland, has been rather driven out of that, while the Scottish independence movement has been noisy and strong, and we're coming up to elections next year, which will show how much strength the SNP actually manages. Do you think that Scotland could thrive economically as an independent country?
I don't think that it could thrive to the extent that it does currently, no. I mean, I'm someone who, I guess, has a kind of foot in both camps, really, and to the extent that I was brought up in Scotland, but my family, a number of them had been brought up in England. My father had been, so I'm kind of a bit of a mixture, and, you know, I'm someone who really does think that actually together we can achieve more. I think it's really important, particularly for the Labour Party, that we work very, very closely with our colleagues in Scotland and in Wales as well. And I've been doing that very, very regularly, talk to colleagues right across the whole of Britain. I think that's critically needed right now. And I also think that, you know, we need to see as much coordination as possible at this time of crisis. Very, very important that, you know, where it's possible to be making decisions in an inclusive way, that really should be happening.
Well, with that, we really have come to the end. So, Annelise Dodds, thank you very much for answering questions from me and everyone. Terrific questions. Thanks for sending them in, answering them at such expanse. And I really, really appreciate that. Everyone, thanks very much for joining us. And if we were in the building, I would say join me in thanking Annelise Dodds, Shadow Chancellor, but I'm simply going to do that in person. Thanks very much indeed for coming.